front forks off my Honda Shadow, which I just took off the other day. I've disassembled one of the front forks, and the second front fork is still in one piece. So this is the front fork once it comes off the motorcycle. Let's take a look at it, this one first of all. So we have it's kind of split into two parts, I suppose. There's the fork tube, which is this piece here. So this has the spring. The fork spring is in the middle of this, the fork tube. So that's why when I press it down, it springs back up. So this is under the force of the spring. And the fork tube slides up and down inside the this large aluminium alloy component, which is called the slider. Okay, so the slider is a little bit wider than the fork tube. The fork tube itself is made from steel, and it's coated with what looks like a very smooth chrome coated finish. Now, you'll probably notice that it's a little bit smoother at the bottom than it is up here. There's a lot of just some rust after setting in here up the top, and that's because this part here is submerged in oil. So it's submerged in this high performance suspension fluid. So it's this is a 500 ml or a half litre. And that full 500 ml, or just a little bit less than that, is actually in the interior of this slider. Okay, so there are the two components that make up the front fork. You can also see here that we have some seals. So the oil inside the fork is kept in via these seals. So this is the seals. There's actually two seals. There's a dust seal, which is the one you can see here, and inside here we have an oil seal. So it's actually just seated in here permanently in the slider, just at about this level. So the oil seal keeps the oil in, and the dust seal keeps the dust and pieces of dirt, that dead flies or whatever that accumulate on the fork tube. The dust seal keeps them out. Now, at the top of the fork tube, we have a little cap. So this little cap can screw off. So it's actually made of plastic. It's just a very simple little cap. It's just to protect the cap bolt. So there's a little bolt here which unscrews off the top of the fork tube. Screw that back on. And at the bottom of the slider we have another bolt, so we have to release this bolt. So we have to unscrew this bolt because the fork tube and the piston, which sit in the middle of the slider, are actually held in the slider by this bolt. So this bolt doesn't actually screw into the slider itself. It screws into the piston that is sitting inside the fork, or the fork slider. So we can also see that there's a little bolt here, and when this bolt is released, it allows the oil, the high performance suspension fluid, to be drained out. So the fluid in this fork has to be drained periodically per the service manual, and you loosen this bolt and it drains all the fluid out. If the fork is still installed in the bike, and then you would remove the cap and the cap bolt to pour fresh oil in. So that's the assembled telescopic front fork. Let's take a look at the one that's disassembled to get a better idea. Okay, so here we'll start off with the slider. As you can see, it's actually a hollow metal tube. It's just a hollow cylinder inside, mostly. At this end there is only a small opening for the bolt. So that bolt is the one that screws into, it actually screws into this piston. Okay, so the piston goes inside of here and it screws into the piston. Now on the piston there's this little oil lock piece. Okay, so again this is just a little metal cylinder which has holes on either side, and it just slots on like this. It slots into the slider and this bolt is screwed in and it secures, both of these pieces are secured to the bottom of the slider. Okay, so they're secured to the bottom of the slider. They can't move up too far because they are screwed in to the bottom of the slider. Now the slider also has this rebound spring, or the piston has this little rebound spring, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But that's the slider. Okay. Now let's put those three components to the side for a minute. So this is the fork tube. So this one we have actually smoothed it out quite well. It has some pitting on it, on the fork tube, particularly at the top. And again, that occurs over, it's a 35-year-old fork tube, so over time they can rust and pitting can occur on the fork tubes, and these are not good for the fork tubes. So I took some steel wool to clean them off and get them as smooth as I can, and a little bit of 1500 sandpaper. Now at the bottom of the fork tube we have a number of components. Here we have the oil seal. Okay, so it's just a little rubber seal. I'll just slide it off just to show you. Okay, so that's the oil seal. So you can see straight through it. It's just basically a tough rubber seal. That's all it is, and it essentially, the dimensions of this oil seal are such that it perfectly, it fits tightly around the fork tube. So it's a very tight fit. Okay. Now the fork tube sits in the slider like so. So it fits in here like this. Okay. And what it does is it actually moves up and down in the slider. Okay. Now the oil seal actually is seated just inside. There's a little seat here. A little seat for the oil seal. So the oil seal is seated in the slider. So it's stuck there. Okay. And it is kept in place by this little spring washer. So this one is actually ruined. It's all rusted out, but it would be a little. It's made of steel essentially, and this little seal has a little seat as well. There's a groove in the slider in which the seal fits into, and once it's seated, it cannot move either, and it keeps the oil seal in place. So the oil seal is seated in the slider, and as the fork tube goes up and down, I'll hold this rubber seal, the oil seal. The fork tube's going up and down. It actually moves up and down inside the oil seal. So the oil seal moves up and down this, or the fork tube moves up and down. And that's how this oil seal keeps the oil, which is all below. Oil seal is contained inside the slider. and it actually keeps the oil from getting to the outside. And then we also have the dust cap, which fits on here as well. Again, it's not as tight, but it is quite tight. The dust cap sits on like that, and its job, again, the two of them are, the fork tube is sliding up and down on the two of them, and the dust seal keeps all the dirt on this side, so any flies, debris from the road, salt, anything at all, dust, it just keeps it on this side. Now when these two seals fail, when the dust seal fails, pieces of dirt end up getting into, start getting it in here to the inside of the fork, and if the oil seal fails, then oil starts to get out and starts to leak through the seals, and you see it all accumulating here on the fork tube. Now the fork tube also has this backup washer. This backup washer is essentially a seat. It's a metal washer, a shaped metal washer on which the oil seal sits. Okay, so it's quite a solid metal piece, and it just sits inside the slider, so it stays with the oil seal. And we have two bushings. So the first one here, this is the slider bushing. So again, this slider bushing is seated inside, it seats just inside the slider. So there's a few different seats here. There's one for the slider, one for the oil seal, one for the spring washer, and there is then one for the dust seal. And the role of the bushing is essentially to provide stability. First of all, it's a metal ring. It's I think it's mainly made of steel, but it has a copper on the copper coating, and coated on top of the copper is some Teflon. Now the Teflon is able to deal with a lot of the heat from friction, and it also provides a non-stick surface. Okay, so the slider, I can slide it off if I want, but I won't. But on the inside, I should examine the slider, and I can see that it slides quite easily, and that's due to the Teflon. If the Teflon wears off, then the slider, or the bushing has to be replaced. So there's a second bushing here. This is the slider bushing because it sits in the slider, and this is the fork tube bushing. So it's a bit thicker, and it is seated on the tube, and it moves up and down with the tube. So these components here, these seals and bushings, are all seated in place like so they don't move. They stay just seated inside the slider. But the bushing on the fork tube, it moves with the fork tube, so it goes up and down like so. And this second bushing plays the same role as this, the slider bushing. It's there to provide a non-stick surface to help the fork tube move up and down easily in the slider. So it has a non-stick Teflon surface underneath which you can see copper colour coming through because it's coated in copper. So the copper is a softer metal than steel. So the Teflon along with the copper should not damage the metal slider as it moves up and down, or will damage it less. Okay, so you have to keep an eye on your bushings. I think the rule, or the advice in the Honda service manual for this particular Honda Shadow model is that if 3/4 of the copper can be seen through the Teflon, then you need to replace the bushings. So these ones are actually okay. There's maybe 1/4 of the copper surface can be seen. Okay. Let's move that now. Okay. Now, the piston is actually seated. Let's just take a look at the piston again quickly. The piston is actually seated inside the fork tube. So the piston is made from what looks like to be steel. It's quite heavy. It's a hollow in the middle. It's hollow in the middle. There is a hole here, but there's a bolt closing that hole. There is holes at the bottom here, so there's one here, there's one here, and one here. So there's 4 holes in the piston, and then there's 2 holes here up the top, just 2 of them. Okay. And I can take the piston. So this is actually called damping piston. So the role of the piston is, as the tube is going up and down in the slider, okay, you have to remember that the fork tube has a cap on it at this end here, which has, this is the little cap bolt with the little screw cap on it, the plastic screw cap, okay, and it has a little oil seal on it as well, a little black oil seal. So that screws in here, okay, and it keeps all the oil, keeps pressure on the oil that's contained inside the tube and the slider. So what happens is, as the, we have to imagine this, it's normally going to be seated like this. Now when you're out on the road and you hit a bump, the fork tube pushes downwards, okay, or the slider is pushed upwards, but either way the fork tube moves downwards in the slider, and it decreases the space inside the telescopic fork tube, okay. So bring it back up, so it comes down and it compresses the oil. So the oil actually gets compressed and it gets squirted down, it gets pressurized down the middle of this piston, and it comes out through these holes here when it gets compressed, okay. So it's the fork tube is moving down and it's compressing the oil, which is coming out through these little holes here, and then as the fork tube goes back upwards, it causes the oil that's sitting in the slider to recirculate back through these little holes and back up through the middle of the piston. So the oil is constantly moving, so it's going down through this piston, it's coming back up through this piston, going down through it, going back up. And it's the movement of this oil that essentially dampens the motion of the piston, or of the fork tube in the slider, right? So why does the fork tube need to be dampened? Well, it needs to be dampened because, let's just build it back up. So let's put our damping piston with a rebound spring into the fork tube. I'll just show you. So this is how it's rebuilt. So down it goes. So there we have our piston, okay, and in our piston they all fit in here. So that's how it's built back up. Okay, so there we had the damping rod, or the damping piston, hitting the bottom of the fork tube, or the slider. So I'm going to screw this bolt back into the piston. Okay. Okay, so the piston is held in place. Okay, so there's our fork tube, which is sliding up and down. Now, normally the fork tube would want to settle at the bottom. Gravity would pull it downwards, and then we would have no suspension. So what keeps it up is that there is this spring. So there's the fork tube spring. Okay? So there's our fork tube spring. So if we take this fork tube spring and we put it in here. Okay. So there's our fork tube spring inserted. On top of the fork tube spring goes this metal, hollow metal spacer. Okay, so it's just a spacer, that's all it is. It's made of some sort of metal. So there it is. Okay, so it's full. At this point it's full. So what I need to do is I need to pull up the fork tube. Keep pulling it up. Okay. So I didn't put in my little oil lock piece, but that's not that important for this demonstration. Okay, now here we have the spacer sitting at the top of the spring, and I can move it up and down and it comes back because of that spring. So to keep the spring on the fork tube, we have to put pressure on it. So the role of this cap is to keep pressure on the fork spring, and this determines the preload of the spring. So there's pressure on the spring, it's called the preload. Now when you hit a bump in the road, let me move it here, the fork tube moves down into the slider like so, okay, and then it's pushed back up by the spring. Okay, so I haven't assembled it, so it's not going to do it exactly. So let's take the assembled fork again. So again, you can see with the cap on, that spring, the spacer takes up about this much space. It's up to about here, and then from here down to here we have the spring, which sits on top of the damper piston. So when we push down, when we hit a bump in the road, it moves down, the spring pressurizes, so this pushes down and pressurizes the spring. So the spring actually pressurizes the damper rod, or the damper piston. So it pushes down on the damper piston, which cannot move because it's screwed to the bottom of the slider. So this motion here is pumping the oil through that piston. So the oil, when I do that, it pumps that oil down through the middle of the piston, and that oil goes out through the holes in the piston. And then, so that's it going down. And when it comes back up, when the fork tube moves back up, it draws the oil from the outside the piston in through the little holes and back up through the piston. So what's happening here is that the oil in the fork tube, it's not getting compressed, it's actually getting circulated. So it's constantly moving around, okay? And the role of that oil and the piston is to damp the movement of the spring. So why do we want to damp the movement of the spring? I'll go back to the spring. Take out our spring and just look at that here. So what happens is, when the spring gets compressed, put it standing here. So when the spring gets compressed, it absorbs all the energy of the impact from hitting a bump in the road or whatever. It gets compressed, and that compression, after it hits the bump, forces it to move back this way. So what will happen is that the oil, or the spring, will oscillate. So we'll go compress, decompress, but when it decompresses, it will, because the energy is still contained in the spring will actually oscillate back. It'll compress again, decompress, compress again, decompress. So the energy that's been absorbed into the spring from hitting the bump in the road causes the spring to oscillate back and forth like this. Now after you hit a bump in the road, it's you don't want the bike to be oscillating for 10, 20, 30 seconds afterwards, going up and down, because the spring is oscillating up and down. So what you need is the energy contained in the spring, which causes it to oscillate back and forth. That energy needs to be taken out of the spring, and it's the role of the piston and the oil, the dampings, which are part of the damping system. The role of the oil and the damping rod, or the damping piston, is to take that energy out of the spring. So the energy from the spring is absorbed into the oil through that damping piston and the oil. So it's the motion of the oil which swirls around, takes the energy out of the spring. It might get turned into some heat in the oil, it'll get turned into some motion in the oil, but the energy is taken out of the spring, and it basically dampens the motion. So the spring, once you hit that bump in the road, the spring will go bong, 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 something like that, okay? It'll very quickly come to a stop, return to its non-moving behaviour. So let's take them out again. Sorry, I have to undo these bolts. And I'm going to talk about the piston a little bit more. So pull it out. Out it comes. Put that to one side. Okay. So we need to consider the oil and the piston. So the damping of that motion of the spring, suspension spring, can be adjusted by changing the grade of the oil. So that is the viscosity of the oil. So the viscosity of the oil is essentially how well it flows through or circulates through the piston. So again, remember, it's going down this way and being pulled, sucked in, and going back up through the middle of the piston, and then coming back through the middle of the piston, coming out through these holes, and coming around the outside of the piston. How quickly that oil flows depends on the grade of oil. So you can actually change the grade of oil. So this is actually a 10 grade. Okay, on the back here for this particular manufacturer, Rock Oil, they have said that the high performance suspension fluids are also available in the following range of viscosities: 2.5, 5, 7.5, 15, 20 and 30. And you can mix the oils as you wish to change the viscosity of the oil. So the grade of the oil, the viscosity of the oil, will affect the damping motion of the piston.